Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to welcome you to today's event, Dismantle Colonialism and Oppression within the Israeli Apartheid System. And a special welcome to our guest speaker, Mr. Ofer Neiman, coming all the way from Israel today. My name is Maya Yaba and I will be moderating today. This event is part of the Israeli Apartheid Week, which takes place at the end of February or at the beginning of March across the world in different locations. The Israeli Apartheid Week takes place for the second time in Austria, and it is organized, among others, by BDS Austria, the Women in Black, and the Palestinian Youth Organization. The local BDS movement in Austria officially started in summer 2014. The abbreviation stands for Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions, and it's a global campaign with goals such as the end of Israel's occupation and colonization of Palestinian land, among others. Today's event should have taken place at the Ameling House. So those of you who have been at the Ameling House and hurried to Hotel Regina to participate, thank you for your coming, and I apologize for the inconvenience. You have likely noticed that prior to this event, a lot of media attention and pressure from various people and organizations like ÖVP and FPÖ contributed to forcing the Ameling House to cancel this event. Not only was there criticism, but threats in the form of cutting subventions in case two events that are part of the Israeli Apartheid Week would take place at the Ameling House. So at this point, I would especially thank the Ameling House for their support and courage. It is not the first incident of this kind in Austria. Only recently, the 91-year-old Holocaust survivor and BDS activist Hedi Epstein was disinvited from the Austrian parliament due to immense pressure. It is certainly something different to oppose apartheid locally in Israel. Our guest, Mr. Ofer Neiman, is part of the association Boycott, supporting the Palestinian BDS call from within, also known as Boycott from Within. Jewish and Arab Israelis support the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement and consider this to be necessary steps to bring the state into alignment with international laws and agreements. Boycott from Within was founded in the year 2008. But now I want to give our guests the opportunity to give us a perspective on the current Palestinian solidarity struggle and on the political situation in Israel. The speech will be kind of interactive, so you will be talking for approximately 20 minutes. And then, if you have any questions, any topic of interest, please refer to it and you will answer it or discuss the topic.
Thank you very much. The idea is maybe for me to speak not too long, and then you can ask questions. And perhaps I can mention the main talking points, and then if you want me to elaborate, to expand on any of these talking points, then you can ask me to do so. So I will say something about my own personal background, then something about Boycott from Within, BDS activism in Israel, something about maybe the foundations of the Israeli political system. Obviously, people know something about it, but some things are not mentioned all that often. And maybe another topic would be the Israeli opposition, or the so-called opposition, the Israeli peace camp. That's something that often interests people, to know how strong, if at all, is the opposition within Israel. So I'm from Jerusalem, from West Jerusalem. I was born in Jerusalem as well. I work as a freelance translator. My family comes from Eastern Europe. On my father's side, from Russia, the Ukraine, on my mother's side, from Poland. On my mother's side, almost the entire family, which was a large family, was murdered around 1942, 43 in Poland. My grandmother survived the war as a nurse with the partisans in Poland. And eventually the family moved to Palestine, Israel in 1949 after the war. And when they got here, by the way, from a camp in Germany for displaced people in, I think it's called Regensburg, they were sent to a depopulated or ethnically cleansed Palestinian village by the name of Tal Arish, near Tel Aviv. So this kind of, in a nutshell, presents, in a way, some of the roots of the problem. That you had people here from refugees from the Holocaust being sent to live in a Palestinian village, maybe less than a year or a year after the owners of the village, the Palestinians, were expelled from that place. I grew up in a secular family, not very political. Politics was not discussed all that often. So basically, I've come to my opinions on my own in a very gradual process. When you grow up in Israel, I would say that in a way, Israeli society is tribal in some ways. I mean, maybe not exactly what you would imagine, but Israeli society is divided into different groups. For example, you have ultra-Orthodox people, you have Palestinian citizens of Israel, and even among Jews, there is a certain divide. For example, there are gaps often between Jews of European descent and Jews of Middle Eastern descent. It's Ashkenazis and Mizrahis. Between people who are more secular and more religious. And nowadays you also have more than 1 million Russian immigrants. I grew up in a secular part of Israeli society. In Israeli terms, it would be left-leaning, but that means in Israel, that would mean non-Likud, maybe more affiliated with the Labor Party. It doesn't mean anything like, like universally for equality in human rights or something like that. But it means that when you grow up in such a place, it's very easy, or it was very easy years ago, to blame everything on the nominal right wing in Israel, on Likud and the settlers. In those years, it was very easy to say something like, "I am against the settlements. I support peace." We have a problem with Likud. At that time, the prime minister was not Netanyahu. We had people like Yitzhak Shamir, if the name rings a bell, so that's kind of the mentality of that so-called tribe within Israeli society, and we still have this sort of pattern of thinking nowadays, especially with Netanyahu's government. Israelis are saying, it's all Netanyahu's fault. We don't have peace because of Netanyahu. But for example, these people are willing to support people like Tzipi Livni or Isaac Herzog and really consider them as a good alternative to Netanyahu, which is, of course, nonsense. When you grow up in Israel, there is, I would call it indoctrination. It's often very subtle. It's not indoctrination in the sense of, I don't know, like a Soviet system. For example, in my school, they took us to, it was in Jerusalem, they took us to Dir Yassin. Dir Yassin is one of the famous, maybe the most famous case of a massacre in 1948 by Zionist forces in a Palestinian village, and this case is considered to be one of the main reasons why many Palestinians fled for genuine fear of a Zionist massacre, and there were also additional massacres carried out against Palestinians. And so they took us to that place, and we learned something about it. And nowadays, I would say the system is much more narrow-minded. Back then, there was some, I don't know, in some ways, the system was a bit more open to discussions and debates. But I would still say that it's a system of indoctrination. So even if you're allowed to criticize some things, you're not allowed, or you're not expected to criticize other things. For example, military service. So even if it's okay for you to criticize the system as a citizen, you're still expected to do your military service. I also did my military service. At that time, I was opposed to everything related to the occupation, the West Bank, but I did serve in Tel Aviv, just to show you the mentality. Because, I mean, it's very difficult to sort of educate yourself. If you educate yourself, it's going to be a very gradual process. Over the years, I've been active in several groups in Israeli politics. And of course, the first groups were so-called Zionist left-wing or soft left-wing groups. Maybe the most prominent name would be Peace Now. Maybe you've heard of that, the name of that group. A group established in 1978 to support peace with Egypt, and also later to support some kind of solution for the occupation. And I can say more about it later if you want, but it's a racist group. It's not a group which supports full equality for Palestinians. And the main concern is not Palestinian human rights. The main concern is how to dismantle the settlements, because settlements are bad for Israel, bad for business, bad for Israelis who are not living in the settlements. And also a very strong, again, a tribal thing of us, secular left-leaning Israelis, against the bad settlers, blaming the settlers and Likud for everything, which is a dishonest approach. But that group has been opposed to settlements. It had a higher profile during the Rabin years, around 20 years ago. I was somewhat active in that group. I've always been supportive of action that was a bit more radical. For example, of soldiers who were refusing to serve in the occupied territories. I can say more about that later, about the history of refusal in Israel. When the Second Intifada broke out, I joined a group by the name of Yesh Gvul, which supports refusers, soldiers who refuse to serve. At that time, it was refusal to serve in the occupied territories. And just to show you how politically conservative Israeli society is, in most places where you have military refusal, people refuse altogether. They just refuse to serve in the army. For example, in the US during the Vietnam War, most of the refusers were not selective refusers. They were not saying, I'm willing to serve in the American military, but not in Vietnam. They were saying, I will not serve, period. In Israel, everything is much more conservative. There is this sense, also, I mean, because of indoctrination, of an existential threat. So even refusing to serve just in the occupied territories is very, very radical. So typically refusal in Israel historically was very selective. People were saying, I will not serve in Lebanon or in the West Bank and Gaza, but I will gladly serve in the Israeli army elsewhere. So when the Second Intifada broke out, I joined Yesh Gvul. It's a support group for refusers. For example, if someone goes to prison, then people can organize a solidarity vigil near that military prison. And by the way, in terms of punishment, it's nothing like what Palestinians go through in terms of going to prison. If an Israeli soldier refuses, he or she will probably be sent to maybe 20, 30 days in military prison, and that's it, most of it. In some cases, they will not be sent to prison at all. I think it's very, very important to try and organize civil disobedience from within. But I've come to the conclusion that we will not be able to change Israeli society just from within, that we need an international campaign. In terms of the number of refusers, Unfortunately, the number has not been on the rise. I think we had more refusers around 10 years ago than the number we have now. And I can say some more about that. So while I was active in that group, I was sort of constantly feeling frustrated with the fact that we're so small, and sort of feeling that we're kind of insignificant in terms of trying to change the political reality. And things became even more difficult after 2005, the so-called disengagement plan, the so-called Israeli withdrawal from Gaza. Gaza is still occupied in a very brutal way, but Israel dismantled the settlements. And after that, sort of activism against the government policies became even weaker. I was feeling quite frustrated, and the BDS campaign. So of course the call was issued in 2005 by Palestinian civil society. The Israeli group was only established in 2009 after CAST led the attack, the massacre in Gaza. Naomi Klein, she's a famous Canadian writer and activist. She came to Palestine, Israel. She gave a talk in Jaffa, and a group of Israeli citizens was launched to support the BDS campaign. I joined that group, and that has been my main thing in terms of activism over the recent years. And I must say, I feel more empowered and maybe even more optimistic nowadays as part of the BDS campaign than as part of these very small Israeli groups acting just within the Israeli reality. I think that for Israelis who are not in my situation, people who are still doing something which is more focused only on Israeli society, just trying to change from within, things can be very, very frustrating. So that's something about my own background. And also, since I work as a freelance translator, I try to help the campaign in several ways by doing volunteer translation work for the campaign. Sometimes for 972 magazine, maybe some of you have seen that source. It's an alternative news source from Israel. If you ask alternative to what, I would say an alternative to Haaretz. So if some of you occasionally read articles in Haaretz, Haaretz is a part of the problem. So we have Gidon Levy and we have Amir Haas. They are very good, but they do not represent Haaretz overall. Okay, that's something about myself in a nutshell. About Boycott from Within. So we're obviously a small group. I mean, we will never be a very large group within Israel. That's not going to happen. We have a few hundred signatures on our statement, our initial statement in support of BDS. We don't have an independent agenda. We are here to support the Palestinian BDS call. And one thing which can be very helpful, especially in a place like Austria, is to express solidarity as Israeli citizens and also as Jews. Because one problem that Palestine solidarity activists and BDS activists abroad experience, again, especially here in Austria, is allegations of racism, anti-Semitism. There is this term coined by Norman Finkelstein, the Holocaust industry. I very much support this term. I mean, it's a very cynical attempt to exploit the Holocaust for a very bad purpose. And also because of my own family background, I find that despicable, and I really think that it's something that should be countered. So we're often asked by campaigns abroad, groups abroad, to support their own BDS initiatives as Israeli citizens, to send our own supportive letter. For example, international musicians. So if you have a look right now at our website, which is Boycott Israel, one word, boycottisrael.info, then you'll see the first item is a letter to an Italian pop star by the name of Eros Ramazzotti, kind of trash pop, probably, I would say. But apparently he's a big star and he's coming to play in Israel next month. And we're also asked by the Italian activists to send him a letter. So you can read that and see for yourself. That's an example. In terms of action within Israel, it's a delicate thing. We have to be careful, especially in the current political climate. 5 years ago, we had a nice action, a nice flash mob in Tel Aviv. The Cape Town Opera came to Tel Aviv to perform Porgy and Bess, of all things, the Cape Town Opera, and performing Porgy and Bess with an all-black ensemble. And we had, obviously, there was a very big BDS campaign around this, done by people in South Africa and also our own group. We had a flash mob in front of the Tel Aviv Opera. And I also understand that you have, that the local campaign has flash mobs here. But we should be, in Israel, it's much more difficult and more subtle. In many cases, it would not be a good idea to have a flash mob. It can be downright dangerous. But we do send letters. We're active on Facebook, on Twitter. We give interviews. And we try to help. We're not very strong on research because we're a small group, but occasionally we can help with information on the ground. Another example, 3 weeks ago, there was a French food festival in Israel, sponsored by the French embassy. And one of the most infuriating things about this festival was that they were actually sponsoring French food stalls in supermarkets even beyond the Green Line. So this runs contrary even to the French government's own political agenda. So we can help on such occasions, for example, by going to these supermarkets, taking photos, and sending these photos as proof, so delivering information from the ground. So this is something we can help with. Okay, maybe in a nutshell about the Israeli political system. Israel is not even defined as a democratic state. I mean, of course, the official Israeli line is that Israel is a democracy, period. But constitutionally, Israel is defined as a Jewish and democratic state. And there is a contradiction between these two terms. And we see that, and we know for a fact, we keep seeing Israeli officials, especially the Israeli Supreme Court, having to handle the contradiction between Jewish and democratic. And obviously, a Jewish and democratic state is not a full democracy, hence it is not a democracy, period. So Israel is not a democracy. Beyond that, Israel is an apartheid state. Very clear in apartheid state if you consider the reality in the West Bank. The fact that you have privileged Israeli settlers who are full Israeli citizens alongside millions of Palestinians who are not even citizens and living under a military occupation with a different set of laws and rules. Israel, the democratic tradition in Israel, even if you ask yourselves about the grassroots level, there is no strong democratic tradition in Israel. One possible reason for this is that most of the immigrants, the Jewish immigrants in Israel, do not come from countries where there is a strong democratic tradition. So if you look at Russia, Poland, and also the Middle Eastern countries, places like Morocco and Iraq, the democratic tradition is not very strong. And of course, you can have a dictatorship emerge in anywhere, and we've seen bad things happen in Europe. But overall, there is no strong democratic tradition. And Zionism is based on, it was at least a very collectivist ideology. People were expected to sacrifice a lot for the common goal, even within the privileged Zionist tribe. Israel itself in the 1950s was very much a one-party state ruled by the Labor Party in a draconian way, with a very strong secret service, the Shabak, which is still very active against Palestinians. And in terms of various forces within the Israeli political system, so the Labor Party is the founding party of Israel. The Labor Party is responsible for the Nakba. So the Nakba is still the biggest crime committed against the Palestinian people, even more than Cast Lead and Protective Edge and the colonization of the West Bank. This was done by the Labor Party, not by Likud. Historically, over the years, between the 50s and the 1970s, there was a change in Israeli society. Israel absorbed hundreds of thousands of immigrants from Morocco, Iraq, Yemen, from Middle Eastern countries. And they were absorbed in a very racist way. There is a great deal of racism even within Jewish Israeli society, predominantly European racism against Jews of Middle Eastern descent. And of course, it's related to racism against Arabs. And the way in which these Jewish immigrants, were absorbed created a great deal of resentment among them towards the Labor Party. And these people, their natural political home became Likud. And that is pretty much the background for a political change that we had in 1977 when Likud came to power. So the bottom line is that it's more of an internal thing within the Jewish Israeli society. But both elements are equally supportive of racist policies towards the Palestinians. Now, ironically, in a way, if you look at the roots of Likud, people like Jabotinsky, perhaps some of you have heard that name. At least in their writings, ideologically, some of these people were more tolerant and compassionate towards Arabs and Palestinians than the Labor Party. The Labor Party has always been about a very, I would say, very brutal pragmatism. And Likud, in terms of its roots, maybe a bit more related to so-called romantic European, nationalist romantic European ideas. So if you look at the writings, occasionally these people would speak of peace and harmony with the Arabs, everyone coexisting, living together. And that's pretty much gone. Even ideologically, one remnant that we still have to a certain extent is the current Israeli president, Rubi Rivlin. I don't support him at all. But there is a difference between President Rivlin and people like Netanyahu and most of the really fascist members of Knesset for Likud. So the Israeli president is not like that. So if you're interested, you can read interviews and see the difference for yourselves. For example, the president, he is genuinely appalled when you have Jewish Israeli lynch mobs assaulting Palestinians on the streets. And I really believe him that he's shocked and that he hates this, unlike so many other supporters of Likud. But ideologically, Likud has always been about supporting the so-called Greater Israel project, which involves the settlements. The Labor Party, because of their pragmatism, have been more open to various ideas of partition. In terms of the West Bank, historically, the Labor Party in the early 1970s and late 1960s was in favor of a certain partition of the West Bank, an Israeli annexation of the southern West Bank, and also the greater Jerusalem area and the Jordan Valley, the so-called Alon Plan, named after an Israeli politician by the name of Yigal Alon, and giving the rest to a Palestinian autonomy or maybe to the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan. So that's kind of in a nutshell about the differences within Israeli politics. Likud historically has been about saying that this belongs to Israel, this land is ours, everything, and we can live in harmony with the Palestinians. For example, there's a famous statement by Prime Minister Menachem Begin from 1978 or something like that, saying Israel will never be another Rhodesia. Rhodesia, nowadays it's Zimbabwe. And at that time there was a struggle for liberation from the white rule of Rhodesia at the time. So that shows you the sort of way of thinking. So the Prime Minister was able to say, we should build settlements, this is our land, but we will respect the Palestinians, we will live in harmony with them, and not see the contradiction or just ignore it. Over the years, things have changed. Likud has become very much a fascist party with very explicit incitement and hatred towards Palestinians. I think that was a very predictable development. When these people see that their agenda is failing, I think that most Israelis realize that Israel is sort of stuck in history without any future unless a significant change is made. The emergence of fascism is a natural consequence. Okay, so maybe something about this. Let's see how much time I have. Okay. So just a few more minutes and then maybe questions. In terms of the Israeli opposition, the peace camp, most of the so-called peace camp is not really a peace camp, or maybe to be a bit more explicit, we should not be discussing peace right now. That's not the main thing that should be on our agenda. The main thing on our agenda should be an anti-apartheid struggle. And peace can only come about as an outcome of justice and equality. So when you have people speaking about peace, all kinds of Israeli groups, just peace and not against apartheid and things like that, we should already become a bit suspicious. And when these people, groups such as, for example, Peace Now, which pretty much cares only about counting the number of settlements and calling for all kinds of deals with Abu Mazen, when these people speak of peace, they are ignoring the apartheid reality. And so we can ask ourselves which groups are doing something against the terrible status quo in Israel and Palestine. In terms of political parties in parliament, things are quite bad. We have a parliament of 120 seats. Out of these 120 seats, I would say that only 13 seats or mandates are held by people who support full democracy. And these are the members of parliament for the so-called joint list or united list, representing predominantly Israel's Palestinian citizens. Beyond that, we have 107 seats held by Zionist parties. And to the left of the Labour Party, there is only one small so-called Zionist left-wing party by the name of Meretz. They have 5 seats. I would still call them racist. They are opposed, they speak out against the occupation, but they are still a part of the problem, and they don't challenge the foundations of racism and apartheid in Israel. So I don't think we can expect a change from within the Israeli parliament. There is a great deal of incitement against this united list. It's basically a political front for all the major parties representing Israel's Palestinian citizens. They're now together, which is a positive development. And well, if you ask me how many Israeli Jews voted for this party, this front, the estimate is something around maybe a few thousand people. So there's a very, very strong divide. So in terms of voting, so you can always say, okay, maybe some people just boycott the elections. But the fact that you have, out of several million Israeli Jews, only a few thousand voted for the only democratic, truly anti-apartheid option in last year's elections, that's not a very positive thing, but we should be aware of that. There is a very strong, because the political system is so weak, especially within the Jewish Israeli sector, which is opposed to Likud policies, there is a very strong NGO sector, NGO, non-governmental organization. We have an industry of NGOs, and it's probably a part of the problem. We have all kinds of NGOs monitoring human rights and issuing reports and so on, and promoting all kinds of coexistence projects and things like that. But it's often a part of the problem because these NGOs, most of them, do not speak about apartheid. They don't speak about war crimes. They don't take legal action against these war crimes. For example, legal action abroad, which is important, which is something that has to be done. And by the way, the group I mentioned earlier, Yesh Gvul, for supporting refusers, one very positive thing to be said about this group is that it did support various initiatives against Israeli officials abroad. For example, an Israeli general, in 2005, he was flying to London. His name is Doron Almog, and an arrest warrant was issued against him in the UK. And at that time, we were pretty much the only group, or one of very few groups, which came out in support of that, of arresting and indicting alleged Israeli war criminals. Another part of the problem is that most of these Israeli NGOs are supported by donors from the US, by liberal Jewish donors from the US. And again, most of these people, for tribal reasons, even if they feel if they don't like the occupation, if they have some compassion for Palestinians, they will not become true dissidents to the entire political structure in Israel. So if they fund certain NGOs, they will only allow them to do so much. So they will give them money to promote a coexistence or anti-racism project, but they will not give them money to say that Israel is an apartheid state or that Israel has not been a democracy for the past 67 years, and so on. So maybe I should stop here. And okay, there's one more thing that I did want to mention about the BDS campaign. So you probably know that BDS has three main components. There's a financial or economic BDS campaign. There's a cultural BDS campaign. I've mentioned this Italian letter to this Italian musician as one example. Another very important project is the academic boycott campaign. And this is probably the campaign which causes a great deal of debate, and things should be clarified about this campaign. So there is a call for an institutional academic boycott of Israeli universities. It's not a call for a personal boycott of Israeli members of academia. Israeli members of academia can go abroad on sabbatical leaves. They can publish in scientific journals. That's not a part of the BDS campaign. But there is an international call for international scholars not to attend conferences held in Israeli universities, not to have joint research projects, institutional research projects with Israeli universities. And I think this is a highly justifiable cause. The reason is that Israeli universities are very complicit in Israeli war crimes and violations of human rights. Israeli universities, such as the Technion, the Tel Aviv University, are often involved in developing weapons which are used against the Palestinian population, especially in Gaza, but also in Lebanon. In a sarcastic way, one can say that Israel has used Lebanon and Gaza as a lab for experimenting, and the local population were, in a way, guinea pigs for various new murderous technologies, often developed with the assistance of Israeli universities. There is a very good documentary by an Israeli filmmaker, Yotam Feldman. It's called The Lab. If you haven't seen it, I highly recommend it. And so an important part of the BDS campaign is to convince people abroad at universities that they should not collaborate on the institutional level with the Technion, with the Tel Aviv University. I have some examples here. If you're interested, you can ask me. I have even some things that I can quote. Yeah, so maybe that's it for now. And then if you have some questions, I can elaborate.
Thank you very much. I have a question for you. How is the interaction between Palestinians and Israelis? Like, for example, Palestinians from the West Bank. Do they have actually any interactions? Do they go to school in Israel? Do they go to universities, or do they have jobs there?
Yeah, well, before the Oslo process, Palestinians were allowed, even Palestinians from Gaza, were allowed to go into Israel. And you had many people, especially from Gaza, working inside Israel. That was a very strong form of exploitation. You had people from Gaza working at restaurants in Tel Aviv, washing dishes and doing the cleaning job. These people had to wake up every day at something like, 3 a.m., go to Tel Aviv through a checkpoint. It was easier at that time, work in Tel Aviv, and then go back to Gaza. Throughout the Oslo years, it has become more and more difficult, now impossible for Palestinians to go from the occupied territories to Jerusalem, to Israel within the 67 borders. Impossible for people from Gaza unless they have a special permit, and it's very, very difficult. Palestinians from East Jerusalem is occupied, it's a part of the territory occupied in 1967. Israel has annexed East Jerusalem, so Palestinians there, they have residency rights. They can travel within Israel, but there are also restrictions imposed on them. Overall, there is a great deal of separation. You have some Palestinians working from the West Bank, working in Israel. They're being exploited. So Israelis growing up now do not have an opportunity to meet Palestinians from the West Bank and Gaza. And there's also a great deal of separation within Israel when you talk about Palestinian citizens of Israel. But one element is that one change in recent years is that Palestinian citizens of Israel, within Israel, something like 1.2 million people, they now have more economic power. In terms of education, they have made a great deal of progress. Many of them work as lawyers, as doctors in Israeli hospitals. And in some places, Israelis can see more and more, Jewish Israelis can see more and more Palestinian citizens of Israel. But this has also created a racist backlash, a counter-response by people who are afraid, the right wing, the fascists, who are trying to incite against Palestinian presence in places such as Tel Aviv and other places. One example, it's very difficult for Palestinian citizens of Israel as students coming, for example, from places in the north, from villages in the Galilee near Haifa, if they come to study at Tel Aviv University, it's very difficult for them to rent apartments in Tel Aviv because many people do not want to have Palestinians renting their apartments.
Okay. As an Israeli citizen, like if he's not active, maybe at your organization, what steps, what action can he take to support BDS, maybe in his daily life?
Yeah, okay, so obviously Israeli citizens are not being asked to boycott Israel. I mean, that's impossible. You have to buy bread or vegetables. I mean, you have to eat and so on. Israeli citizens are only asked to express solidarity with the campaign. That's all Israelis are being asked for. Israeli citizens can boycott selectively. For example, not buy products made in settlements in the West Bank. That's something that can be done. And one of the things that our group, Boycott from Within, criticizes Israelis on the so-called left about is that these people are not even promoting, for example, groups such as Peace Now, they're not even promoting a selective boycott of settlement products. They could have done that, but they're not doing it. Something that should be mentioned is that there is a law in Israel, it's called the Boycott Law, which makes it possible to sue Israeli citizens who are calling for a boycott. If someone is affected, harmed by the boycott, then this person can sue us for damages. We're still calling on people to boycott Israel, and we think that other people should do the same. And at least those people on the so-called who regard themselves as a part of the peace camp, they should at least be promoting a selective boycott of settlement products, and they're not doing even that.
Okay. Do we have any questions from the audience? Please.
Just a very simple question. The way I understand the situation, and perhaps I understand it poorly, the problem in the conflict is really about right-wing groups on both sides believing themselves to be in very strong conflict with each other. And since on the Palestinian side, Palestinian left-wing people are more closer to Palestinian right-wing people, and left-wing Israelis are closer to right-wing Israelis, where do you see the responsibility of left-wing people on both sides engaging the right-wing on their side of the border to somehow try to contain these two aggressive animals being caught in this fight for decades?
Well, this is not a symmetrical conflict. I mean, the thing is that whether you're a Palestinian who supports Hamas or, you know, a classical, Palestinian intellectual, a hippie who supports all the universal left-wing principles, you'll still live under the same occupation. And even if you're a so-called nice leftist Palestinian, you will suffer from the same occupation. So the thing is that Palestinians do not really have agency. So I think that the main thing is not to say that, left-wing Israelis should counter right-wing Israelis and left-wing Palestinians should counter right-wing Palestinians. It's Israelis and Palestinians and people all over the world should come together for this non-violent campaign for justice and equality. So that's the way I see it.
Yes, please.
I would like you to, if I may, ask you about your opinion about more normalization. I know that many people are against it in Palestine.
Yeah.
Even with normalizing and working together with Israelis who are leftists, there is a reluctance, I think.
Okay. So first of all, I mean, if it comes to working with an Israeli university, then we're asking people to boycott this. I mean, this is boycottable normalization based on the BDS principles. There is a great deal of reluctance in Palestinian society to work with Israeli groups because Palestinians have learned over the years that many, I would say most Israeli groups have very little to offer them or have not acted in full solidarity with the Palestinian cause. So Palestinians are suspicious for a very good reason. So I can say that we have great relations, very friendly relations with Palestinians who promote the BDS campaign. So Israelis and Palestinians can work together and do BDS. There are Israeli activists, for example, from the Anarchists Against the Wall. It's a small group of Israelis who are really courageous and dedicated and support full equality. And they go to the demonstrations in Palestinian villages every Friday and Saturday. And they're best friends with Palestinians. There is no problem. So I think that Palestinians and Israeli citizens can work together and are working together when it comes to a genuine struggle for justice and equality. And beyond that, Palestinians have learned that many of the so-called peace groups are not really doing what has to be done to end the suffering, to end apartheid.
Please.
What is your experience with governments participating in the BDS movement? I mean, we all know it's a grassroots movement and campaign. But, for instance, in the last Gaza massacre, there was Bolivia saying we will boycott Israel. I think it was the only country that said it in that clear manner. But, for instance, in Europe, we've seen Greece, the first time a left government was elected in Greece, and they said before they were elected that one of the main points when they get elected is recognizing Palestine. Now we have seen that this charismatic Alexis Tsipras hasn't done anything near to that, what he had promised. And this is just one example. In Canada, Trudeau, another charismatic young left politician, has done more or less the same, if not worse. And so what is your assessment on having governments helping and supporting the movement?
So obviously, it's more of a Western problem. There are certain so we can have a look at various continents and countries. There is some support from governments in Latin America. Brazil, for example, has not endorsed BDS, but they have rejected an ambassador, Dani Dayan, who lives in a settlement. And that's quite significant. That was a diplomatic blow to Netanyahu, his ambassador being rejected by Brazil. We have support from the ANC, the African National Congress in South Africa. They support BDS. The South African government itself, its position is not as good. Regarding Greece and Canada, so first of all, Greece, I mean, Tsipras has been a major disappointment, but the thing that he's been a sellout on all fronts, also in terms of the people in Greece. Regarding Israel, what seems to have happened is that there is, behind the scenes, there are very strong connections between Israel and Greece regarding the gas fields in the Mediterranean, and Greece is now in crisis. Apparently, this is something that is perceived by Tsipras as a potential of wealth, something that can help Greece recover. So that's probably one reason. Another possible reason, cooperation between the arms industries, perhaps, Israel and Greece cooperating. But with Tsipras, it's not just about Palestine. It's more than that. But he's gone very, very far in a bad way. When he visited Israel 2 months ago, he actually, in a way, endorsed Jerusalem, the illegal unification of Jerusalem under Israeli sovereignty, in terms of his statement, what he wrote in President Rivlin's guest book. So he's a major disappointment. Regarding Trudeau, I think it could have been expected. I mean, Trudeau has always been against BDS and Palestine solidarity. I don't know how much of a leftist he is. He is against racism, the way in which he receives Syrian refugees. He's very nice, but he's not sort of, and in general, over the years, Canada has been very, very supportive of Israel, in some ways even more than the US. There's some literature about that as well if you're interested. So we were not expecting much from Trudeau. The thing with governments, I mean, governments are not going to lead the way when it comes to BDS, but we should be hopeful and we should be striving for various specific sanctions implemented by governments. For example, I think that even based on international law and basic common sense, we should be insisting on Israeli settlement products being completely banned from the EU. Not just labeling. Labeling is insufficient. We should be campaigning for a ban and expecting governments to do that. So naturally, governments are. It's difficult to imagine a European government endorsing BDS in its entirety, including the cultural BDS and so on. But we should sort of apply pressure to promote selective sanctions coming from these governments. Also, arms embargoes. Over the years, we've had some arms embargoes imposed on Israel by Western governments. For example, during the first Lebanon War in 1982, whenever Israel commits a large-scale massacre, there is usually something like an embargo. We should work harder to promote this embargo. Of course, it's very, very difficult because the various European arms industries are profiting from these deals, and these are the most cynical players in politics in general. The arms dealers, they're not people, very conscientious people, but there is something to be done here based on grassroots pressure.
Okay, yes, please, in the back.
I would be very interested to know, because you said it was a long process until you became aware of the place you're living. So how was it to become step by step aware? I mean, on a friend circle, family, society.
Yeah. So one thing that personally I've always been very kind of open or affected by reports about human rights violations on the ground in the West Bank in Gaza. For example, reports by B'Tselem. If you've heard, B'Tselem is a famous human rights NGO. And in terms of the reports which they published, they do very good work. And when I was reading about these very specific cases of brutality and abuse on the ground, this had a strong impact on me. And beyond that, a very gradual process of becoming disillusioned with political groups in Israel. For example, when I was active in Peace Now, there were all kinds of actions promoted by groups which were a bit maybe more radical, more left-leaning. And when time and time again I saw that Peace Now was reluctant to join these initiatives because they said, no, we should appeal to the Israeli public. And, for example, there's one guy in Peace Now said, we don't do human rights. He said that. They are against the settlements because it's bad for Israel. But he said, we don't do human rights. So I mean, don't count on them when it comes to a very serious case of abuse, war crimes, things like that. So you get to see who expresses solidarity and who doesn't express solidarity, and this affects you. So my conclusion was to sort of drift towards groups which had more solidarity on the personal level towards victims of human rights abuses. But it was a very gradual process.
But my question was more on the personal level, like your family, your friends. Did you lose some friends? Did people attack you, call you traitor?
Personally, not so much, not so many problems in my own circles. I had one problem with students of mine a few years ago. Occasionally, some harassment on Facebook, things like that. For me, it hasn't been very difficult. For other people, it may be difficult. Problems with members of their family, with friends, losing friends, things like that. It can be very, very difficult. I mean, and I've heard of cases during the first Lebanon War, and that was the first wave of refusal. People were refusing to serve in 1982. For example, some people sort of becoming alienated from their families. Their parents didn't want them in their house anymore. Things like that. Some people have serious problems. For me, it hasn't been difficult with respect to this.
Okay, yes, please.
Sorry, I would speak with you from a Palestinian to an Israeli. I'm a Palestinian refugee born in Lebanon. What I want to say is, I still have the key. I'm from Jerusalem, by the way, and I still have the key for the home of my grandparents. What would you say as a settler in Jerusalem to me?
Mm-hmm.
How can I go back to my home?
Mm-hmm.
We are born in the camp with the belief that we really want to go back home, and we deserve this. We are not a violence nation, and I oppose you the way you were talking. You were saying that the Israeli Jewish, my problem is not with the Jewish religion. I have friends from Jewish. I have Jewish friends from Hungary, from Spain, from all over the world. The way you are talking, not only you, the Israeli media only, also, and the American media and the European media are also specifying that the Israeli government is only Jewish. It's not only Jewish, because my problem is not with Jewish people. My problem is with the Zionistic mentality that says that we have to go out and this is their lens. On the other side, I would say from the religion part, Palestine is the place where the three main religions on this planet were born: the Jewish, the Christian, and the Muslim. I would like to ask you, why don't you think that Christians also are free to settle down in Palestine? Jesus was born there. Jesus is a Palestinian, don't forget.
So I think you misunderstood what I was saying. I said nothing against Judaism. It's just a way of labeling and saying that we have parts of Israeli society. We have Jewish Israelis, we have Arab Israelis. I was not saying anything about Judaism. It's a very, very important point. There is no problem.
You said it more than 4 times.
And I can say it maybe 10 times, but it's just a way of describing Israeli society. There is no problem with Jews. And believe me, based on my family's history, if I see someone who has problems with Jews, and occasionally I do see so-called Palestine solidarity campaigners who express anti-Semitic views, believe me, I have zero patience for these people, okay? And I can show you quotes. So you've just misunderstood me. Okay.
Sorry for interrupting. The negative use of this phrase spreads the hate in our Arab countries toward the Jewish people.
Again, it's you have Jews in Israel. That's a fact. I am a Jewish Israeli. So that's a way of describing a part of Israeli society, okay? When you use the term Zionist, it's, by the way, and there are some very nasty anti-Semitic people. Of course, I'm not accusing you, that's not you, other people, who are using the term Zionist nowadays to spread anti-Semitism against Jews, because these people know that saying Jews right now is very bad, but you can see things which are very anti-Semitic, but people just use the word Zionist instead of Jews. So you have to look at the entire message. I mean, it's not, you can use the term Zionist for anti-Semitic purposes, and you can use the term Jew for anti-apartheid, for justice and equality reasons. So that's just to clarify it. And I have to use this term because Israeli society is divided into various populations. And you can generalize, you can certainly generalize about the Jewish part of Israeli society. For example, more than 90% of Jewish Israelis supported the massacre in Gaza. And if you look at Palestinian, if you want to use the term Arab Israelis or Palestinian citizens of Israel, much less than 90%, almost much closer to zero, supported the massacre in Gaza. So we need that in our language in order to describe the political reality. That's one thing. And the BDS campaign is strongly opposed to racism. In fact, you have a statement issued a few years ago by prominent activists, including Palestinian leaders. People like Ali Abu Nima, Electronic Intifada, if you've seen the website, or Omar Barghouti, one of the founding figures of BDS, expressing their opposition to anti-Semitism, okay? That's one thing. Regarding refugees, so BDS has 3 principles. One of the principles is respecting the rights of Palestinian refugees to return to their homeland. So it's as simple as that. BDS calls for a just solution based on international law and justice for the problem of the Palestinian refugees, meaning that Palestinian refugees will be allowed to go back. So, of course, the main problem with Israel is 1948. It's not 1967. Where I live in Jerusalem, my own house stands on church land, so there was no Palestinian village right there, but in my area, there was a Palestinian village by the name of Sheikh Badr, and nowadays you have the Knesset and the Israel Museum there. So of course the root of all evil, in a way, that's the Nakba of 1948, and BDS is very much about the Nakba and making it possible for refugees to return and to have their own problems solved. Regarding various religions, so of course, I mean, everyone should be allowed to live in Palestine, and you know, like when someone says occasionally, I mean, when someone, one of the manifestations of an anti-Semitic, anti-Jewish, racist view would be kick the settlers out of Palestine, meaning like Israeli Jews. So I'm opposed to that as well. I mean, everyone should be allowed to live in Palestine, of course, including Christians as well. I mean, no question about that. So I hope this answers your question.
Do you agree that the cause of that we cannot have peace between Palestinians and Israelis goes back to the Palestinians or to the Israeli governments?
So the thing is, the average Israeli is no better or worse than the average Palestinian, but the root of the problem is Zionism. It's a colonial movement. It started in the late 19th century. So the problem, I would say, in one sentence, the problem is Zionism. So you have good Israeli Jews and bad Palestinians on the personal level. Everyone should be allowed to live there in peace and equality. The core problem is Zionism.
Okay, yes, please.
Yeah, you mentioned in your talk a law against, calling for boycott and so on from within Israel. It's just one of a series, I understand, of very repressive laws. So first of all, I'd be interested to know how this boycott law affects BDS in Israel itself. Related to that, there's another law that I recently heard about, which is something about an NGO law. In other words, the Knesset either has done so already or will pass a law that will force all NGOs, you mentioned the NGO problem as well, force all NGOs to sort of declare where their finances come from. And I understand there was even an idea that if they come and talk in the Knesset, they would have to wear a special badge to identify them as receiving funds from abroad. So I'd like you to comment on that, and perhaps on the whole area of discriminatory laws, period, anti-democratic laws, which are already there. And then one very concrete question. There is an NGO called NGO Monitor, and I would be interested in knowing if there's any relationship between that NGO Monitor and the Knesset members, that are pushing for this law.
Yeah. Okay. So regarding the NGO law, so yeah, exactly the way you put it. I mean, some right-wing members of Knesset, they're pushing for this legislation to force representatives of Israeli NGOs, the left-wing or peace NGOs, whatever, human rights NGOs, to wear special badges. A very humiliating, in a way, maybe resembles a dark episode in European history where Jews in medieval Europe maybe had to wear special badges, and also we know something about the 20th century, to sort of keep them sort of humiliated and identified as something which is separate and inferior. So that's one law. Regarding the boycott law, boycott from within is still pushing for BDS in its entirety. We are very, very explicit, but the softer groups, which were a bit more vocal in supporting maybe a boycott of settlement products, groups such as Gush Shalom, Uri Avneri, if you've heard that name, they have gone silent because of that law. I have some major disagreements with these groups, even with Uri Avneri, because of that law. So they've gone silent. We're still doing what we're doing. So far, no one has been sued. And there is an entire array of pieces of legislation put forward by various members of Knesset. Some of these proposals are very ridiculous. We're going to see what happens with that. I think that it shows that these people are desperate. I mean, they need a scapegoat. They need a scapegoat. They realize that there is a failure here. And the interesting development is that in a way they are now targeting even privileged Jewish Israelis. Before that, it was all about targeting Palestinians. That was easy. In terms of persecuting Palestinian NGOs also within Israel, Shabak has been doing that for years. It's possible to shut them down very easily. Now we're seeing more and more attempts targeting more prominent, again, I have to use the term Jewish Israeli group in the sense that B'Tselem was founded by Jewish Israelis, and it's sort of identified as a group run by Jewish Israelis and not by Palestinian citizens of Israel. And there's also a great deal of incitement against these groups, so we're going to see what happens with that. And NGO Monitor. So there is also an entire industry of right-wing NGOs monitoring the so-called human rights NGOs, the so-called left-wing NGOs. They have very generous funding from the US, from right-wing supporters of Israel in the US. They work in cooperation with Likud, with members of parliament for sure. There is also another NGO by the name of Shurat Hadin, which is, they are trying to sue internationally, abroad, in various places, to sue people who support BDS. And we have pretty strong evidence that they have good connections with the government and with Mossad as well to do their work. And they have a lot of money to do what they're doing. And the main political group doing the incitement against NGOs, human rights NGOs in Israel, a group by the name of Im Tirtzu. Im Tirtzu, we know that they were founded by people in Netanyahu's circles. It's not really a grassroots group. It was founded by people in his circles. They have been receiving donations from people who support Netanyahu. So a great deal of these efforts now targeting Israeli NGOs are coming from Netanyahu's political circles.
Okay. Maybe 2 or 3 questions. Yes, please.
I thank you for the witness of your own political development. I have respect for your itinerary and also respect for the itinerary of all the persons here present. And you analyzed clearly how more conservative the society there is and how endangered the opposition is. You said we will never be a big group and so on. It's very difficult for you, even what you said at the end now. Then was one question, where there was a question of the supporting government from outside. It's also extremely limited. So I want to refer now to South African history. The advantage there was that there was a relatively small white minority, but still completely in power, maybe 25% from the whole population. But in the country, you got the civil society, all kinds of people, from the students' movement, trade unions, and at the end, a democratic united front. And so that was very strong. But still in South Africa, although the Western governments, and Western Europe, of course America, were strongly supporting this apartheid government, but still slowly they were pressured by the anti-apartheid movement internationally. And that was very important. South Africa, although the civil society was very well organized, each street in each township was very mobilized. But it was the importance of these international support groups. And this question had not been raised so far, what you expect from the international movements, even from a small city like here. And of course we are threatened. That's not otherwise to expect it. But the Palestinians who are here living, and the Austrian, everybody, what we are expected, what we can contribute, and how we can also avoid fighting amongst ourselves. how we can really collaborate in a constructive way.
Okay. So, I mean, I'm very impressed by what I'm seeing here. So basically the answer would be keep doing what you're doing now and try to grow the movement and work with the Palestinian organizers, with Palestinian BDS groups, listen to what they have to say, but basically keep doing what you're doing and talk to people and convince them. And obviously, yeah, regarding South Africa, there was an international grassroots campaign. You know, as late as 1990, people like Dick Cheney were saying that Mandela was a terrorist. And you had Thatcher in power in the UK, and she was pretty much supportive of the apartheid regime. Yet the regime fell. So there's a lot that we can do. And we're seeing major BDS successes now. For example, we have news from yesterday about G4S, a major international company, pulling out of Israel now. They're going to pull out of Israel. So we can achieve a lot together. Another positive development is that we're seeing more and more young Jews in America, in the US, becoming very critical of Israel. There is a wonderful group by the name of Jewish Voice for Peace in the US. And that's a group which has peace in its name, but they are really they're taking action for justice and equality and anti-apartheid. They support BDS. And the movement keeps growing, and you see more and more young people, young Jews in America expressing their disgust with Israel, saying Israel does not represent us. There is a growing gap between young Jews in America and Israel. And I think this is going to have a strong impact, a positive impact for a change in the future. I cannot even say that I'm very optimistic towards the future, but we always have a choice, you know, and if it's not BDS, it's going to be more violence and bloodshed. So we can always, at least we can try and minimize the bloodshed and try to form some kind of an alternative.
Okay, one last question. Okay, yes, please.
You were talking in your speech about this subtle indoctrination that you were experiencing as well when you were young. But could you elaborate a bit more how this subtle indoctrination one can picture it?
Yeah, one example, when we were 16 years old, they sent us from school to an Air Force base in the Negev to volunteer there for a week. And that was also the place where you have the Air Force Academy for pilots. So you try to encourage people from certain schools to go there and to be inspired and become excited about joining the army and maybe even trying to become pilots and things like that. And it exists everywhere. And of course, nowadays in Israel, it's much stronger. You have, for example, even kindergarten children being encouraged to send packages to soldiers with letters and sweets and things like that. And even during the massacre in Gaza a year and a half ago, even the universities, Tel Aviv University and the Hebrew University, they were organizing packages to be sent to soldiers. So you even had the universities doing that. So these are a few examples, and it's a very, very long list. If anyone is interested, I can sort of send you links and the ways in which children are indoctrinated in Israel from a very, very early age.
Okay, just one little question. I mean, we have here in Europe the discussion that the BDS movement is kind of a disguise for anti-Semitism. The recent events were kind of all in this direction. BDS is anti-Semitism, and so on. What do you think about that?
Well, I mean, it's very difficult to counter that. I mean, they are trying to trash and smear us. I think we have to be very firm and say, look, these are the principles. We are not racist. You are racist. So instead of trying to apologize and be defensive, we should sort of push back and say, you are racist. We can prove that your policies are racist. How dare you lecture us as an anti-racism movement. Because otherwise, I mean, it doesn't make any sense. I mean, they're just trying to make us apologize. And overall, I am convinced, I mean, the BDS movement, the Palestine Solidarity Movement, is an anti-racism movement. Occasionally, you do meet some racist people who have maybe an anti-Jewish agenda. But, you know, the Palestinian leaders of the movement are the first ones to recognize that and to sort of kick these people out.